In Wellington, Texas, people didn't change. The church pews stayed filled every Sunday. The flags never left the porches, and boys were still expected to throw a football before they could spell diplomacy. Lincoln James, at 14, didn't fit any mold the town recognized. While other boys roughhoused in dirt lots and swapped stories about hunting trips, Lincoln preferred the quiet company of his piano, the worn keys of which had absorbed more of his soul than any person around. He didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't play sports. He read books about war and peace, wrote poems in secret, and found comfort in the rhythm of music instead of the roar of crowds. This made him a target, a quiet boy in a loud world. It wasn't just the students. Teachers sometimes smirked when he volunteered to play piano at assemblies instead of joining the football team. SISSY was the word they used, thrown at him in hallways, scribbled on his locker, whispered behind his back with mocking chuckles. He learned to keep his head down, shoulders low, and disappear as best he could. But in a town that celebrated loud pride and saw quiet as weakness, invisibility was never guaranteed. He lived with his grandfather, Raymond James, a man built of granite and ritual. A retired army sergeant who served in Iraq, Raymond had lost his son, Lincoln's father, in a car accident when Lincoln was 6. Since then, it was just the two of them on the edge of town, in a creaky white house that smelled of leather and gun oil. Raymond was a man of routine. 6 a.m. coffee, 7 a.m. chores, and no excuses after that. His silence wasn't cruel, but it was heavy. Lincoln respected him, feared him a little, and above all, didn't want to disappoint him. That unspoken fear shaped much of Lincoln's world. Raymond didn't understand the boy's world of piano recitals and spiral notebooks filled with lines of poetry. He didn't stop Lincoln, but he didn't encourage him either. His eyes, tired and watchful, lingered a little too long when Lincoln mentioned a new composition or asked him to come to a school event. "We'll see," was the standard response, which usually meant no. When Lincoln overheard Raymond talking to a neighbor about maybe enrolling him in a military boarding school, he didn't cry. He just started staying up later, playing his music with headphones, scribbling verses he never showed anyone. He didn't want to lose himself just to be acceptable. It all built to a quiet storm. The school announced a Veterans Day assembly, asking students to participate. Lincoln surprised everyone by volunteering to write and perform a poem in honor of his grandfather. The English teacher approved it quickly, perhaps with curiosity, or maybe just to see how badly it would go. Lincoln spent 3 days crafting, every line pouring his admiration, his pain, and his hope for connection into the verses. He memorized it, practiced it, and when the day arrived, he ironed his shirt twice, combed his hair neatly, and walked into the school auditorium with shaking hands. The room was full, parents, students, local veterans, and teachers. Lincoln spotted empty seats and imagined his grandfather might walk in late in uniform with that stiff military pride. He clung to the image like a life preserver. His name was called. He stepped onto the stage. At first, silence. Then a voice, soft, deliberate. "My grandfather is a soldier." He barely got 3 stanzas in when it started. Snickers from the back, a cough disguised as a laugh, a mocking whisper mimicking his voice. Lincoln tried to push through, raising his voice slightly, but it only made things worse. By the 4th stanza, someone imitated him out loud. "My grandpa wears boots and my shoes are ballet," a cruel twist that drew full laughter. The teacher didn't stop them. The principal remained seated. The veteran guest averted his eyes. Lincoln's throat locked. His hands clenched the paper. He looked at the crowd, then to the side door where he'd imagined his grandfather would appear. No one came. His voice vanished. Quietly, he stepped away from the microphone, down the steps, and out through the side hall without a word. The laughter still echoed. He didn't go back to class. He walked home. Raymond wasn't there yet. Lincoln went straight to his room, closed the door and sat at his piano. He didn't play. His hands hovered above the keys but never touched them. That night, they didn't speak. Raymond made dinner. Lincoln said he wasn't hungry. Upstairs, the boy sat on the floor, paper crumpled in his hand. Something in him dimmed. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was betrayal, not by any one person, but by a world that claimed to honor courage, only to humiliate the kind it didn't understand. Raymond noticed the change. He didn't ask, but the silence was different, less teenage sulking, more like quiet surrender. That night, after Lincoln went to bed, Raymond sat outside on the porch, his coffee long cold, watching the stars. He lit a cigarette, a habit he thought he'd kicked. Then he pulled out his phone and saw the video. Some student had filmed the whole thing, Lincoln standing alone, trying to be heard while the crowd laughed him down. It wasn't long, just a minute and a half. But Raymond watched it 3 times. By the third viewing, his jaw was set. He wasn't angry at the students, not even the teachers. He was angry at himself, for not being there, for not standing behind the boy who bore his name, for allowing the world to chip away at his grandson while he stayed quiet out of discomfort. Raymond James had worn many uniforms in his life. He had saluted flags, buried brothers, and followed orders without question. But in that moment, sitting alone with a cold drink and a burning cigarette, he realized this was a battlefield he'd never trained for. He stood, walked into the house, and opened a locked trunk in his closet. The uniform was still there, polished, pressed, untouched since his last military funeral. He laid it out on the bed piece by piece, the boots, the cap, the medals. He looked in the mirror and didn't see the hardened soldier anymore. He saw a grandfather who had one more mission left, one that didn't involve war zones or weapons, one that demanded something he'd always admired in others, but rarely practiced himself: unquestionable courage in defense of what's right. The next morning came fast. The video had made its rounds through the school by sunrise. Kids were still laughing about it in the halls, replaying the clip on their phones, imitating Lincoln's voice like it was a comedy act. The teachers didn't say much, and the ones who did called it kids being kids. Lincoln kept his head down, walking through it like fog, numb to the noise, too tired to even look embarrassed. He didn't cry anymore. That part of him had shut off. The poem, now balled up in his pocket, felt like a weight. Every step he took, he wanted to disappear deeper into the floor. Raymond didn't go to work that day. He didn't shave. He sat, in silence, with the uniform laid out across his bed. His decision was made the night before, and once a man like him makes up his mind, there's no going back. He ate a hard-boiled egg, laced up his old combat boots, and got into his truck. The drive to the school was quiet, but inside his mind, it was anything but. For decades, he had taught himself to be silent when things got complicated. But watching Lincoln stand on that stage, alone, ridiculed, and trying to honor someone who didn't even show up, broke something in him that had been locked away for years. At Wellington High School, heads turned before Raymond even stepped. Inside, the uniform caught everyone's attention. The hallways buzzed with whispers. Some of the older staff recognized him immediately. Others stared at the stern man with broad shoulders and polished boots like he'd stepped out of a movie. Without hesitation, Raymond made his way to the front office and requested the principal. She greeted him with a practiced smile that faded quickly as he said, "You're going to want to bring everyone to the cafeteria. Teachers, students. I've got something to say." 15 minutes later, the intercom called an all-school assembly. The students shuffled into the cafeteria, confused but curious. Lincoln, seated near the back with his hands in his pockets, hadn't even looked up until he heard the sound of military boots against tile. Then he saw him, his grandfather, fully dressed in his formal army blues, chest covered in ribbons, standing behind the mic. Lincoln's heart stopped. Everything around him blurred as Raymond took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Raymond James. I served this country for 30 years. I've seen combat, lost friends and buried brothers, but nothing I've seen out there compares to the cowardice I witnessed yesterday in this school." The room went still. Students who had laughed the day before stared at the floor. Raymond continued, "That boy you mocked, my grandson, stood alone with nothing but his words and his heart. That is courage. That is what it means to be brave. I wore this uniform to protect the freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom to be exactly who God made you to be. And he did that in front of all of you while you laughed. You could have heard a pin drop. A teacher near the front wiped her eyes. Some of the students looked down in shame. Raymond's voice didn't crack, but his jaw tightened as he looked directly at Lincoln. "When I served, I thought bravery was about how many enemies you could face. I was wrong. Bravery is standing on that stage, unarmed, vulnerable, telling the truth anyway." He turned back to the crowd. "You don't have to understand someone to respect them. You just have to be decent." With nothing else, he nodded once and stepped away from the mic. Lincoln sat frozen, his face burning, his heart thundering in his chest. As Raymond walked past him, he gave the boy a single look, not of pity or apology, but pride, deep, unshakable pride. That moment, more than any award, medal, or salute, stayed etched in Lincoln's mind. His grandfather had seen him, stood up for him, not as a child in need of protection, but as a young man worthy of it. After that day, things changed, slowly but noticeably. No more name-calling. The boys in the locker room kept their comments to themselves. Teachers who had once looked the other way began to actually step in, and Lincoln, who had become used to walking with his head down, began to walk with his chin up. He didn't become popular overnight, but he became respected. More than that, he stopped trying to disappear. He started staying after school to help tune the choir piano, even offered to teach music to the younger kids. He wasn't trying to prove anything, he was just being himself finally, without apology. At home, Raymond started to change too. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. He asked Lincoln about his music, actually listened when he played. One evening he stood in the hallway unseen as Lincoln played a slow, haunting melody. He stayed until the last note. That night at dinner he asked, "Did you write that one?" Lincoln nodded. "Sounded like something a soldier would play at dawn," Raymond said. Lincoln didn't answer, but the look on his face said everything. For the first time their silence was shared, not as distance, but as understanding. Even the town, slow as it was to change, started to shift. People talked about what Raymond did that day. Some praised him, others said it was unnecessary, but no one forgot it. And Lincoln, without even trying, became a symbol of quiet courage, of conviction, of the kind of strength that didn't need to shout to be real. The boy they called SISSY had shown them what real bravery looked like, and the man they thought had no softness left in him reminded them that honor wasn't about hardness. It was about doing what was right, no matter who was watching. The days that followed moved with a quiet shift. The school still functioned like it always had. Bells rang, teachers lectured, students complained. But something in the air had changed. Lincoln walked through the halls and wasn't invisible anymore. There were nods now, quiet, unsure acknowledgments from classmates who'd once rolled their eyes at him. Some looked embarrassed, others simply curious. Even the ones who'd laughed loudest at his poem avoided eye contact. He didn't seek revenge or recognition. He just kept doing what he did. Piano at lunch, tutoring kids after school, living in a way that no longer bent under the weight of other people's expectations. The whisper of shame that had followed him for years had lost its grip. At home, Raymond was different too. Not in the grand gestures people might expect, but in the small, telling ways that mattered more. He started leaving Lincoln's favorite cereal on the table in the morning. He sat on the porch instead of the garage in the evenings. letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. And sometimes, when Lincoln played piano in the evenings, Raymond listened. He didn't always say something, but his presence in the room spoke louder than words. Lincoln didn't push. He knew his grandfather wasn't a man who expressed things easily, but he felt the difference. The tension that had lived between them for so long began to soften. It was one of those quiet weekends when the second crack in the story opened. Lincoln was cleaning the living room when he noticed Raymond dragging a dusty box out from the closet. It wasn't marked, but it looked old. Aged leather, fraying edges. Without saying anything, Raymond motioned for Lincoln to sit down. Then, for the first time in either of their lives, the old soldier opened up. Inside the box were notebooks, sketch pads, and photos Lincoln had never seen before. One photo in particular stood out. A boy about Lincoln's age holding a drawing of a flower in a stiff, posed portrait. Raymond handed it to him without a word. Lincoln looked up, confused. "That's me," Raymond finally said, his voice low. 12 years old, liked to draw, write. I had a journal under the floorboard so my father wouldn't find it. He said drawing was for girls, that I needed to toughen up. He paused, jaw clenched. He caught me once, tore up everything, told me he'd rather have a dead son than a weak one. The words dropped like bricks. Lincoln sat still, stunned. I signed up for the army the day I turned 18, figured it'd fix me, make me the man he wanted me to be. I kept the uniform, lost the rest. Lincoln didn't know what to say. For all the stories he had imagined about his grandfather, none of them included this version. A scared, artistic boy who had been taught to bury his heart. Raymond wasn't finished. I saw what you did up on that stage, and I knew I'd failed you, not because you're different, but because I let you think being different was something to be ashamed of. I let my silence be louder than your voice. His eyes, usually hard and unreadable, were wet. You were braver in 5 minutes than I was in 50 years. For Lincoln, the moment was a storm of emotion, relief, understanding, and a sudden, overwhelming sense of connection. All the things he'd never been able to explain now made sense. He wasn't broken. He wasn't weak. He came from a line of men who'd simply never been allowed to speak their truths. And here was his grandfather, trying to break that chain before it crushed another generation. Lincoln didn't cry, but he stood up, walked around the table, and hugged the old man who had always seemed too tough to touch. For a long second, Raymond didn't move. Then his arms wrapped around his grandson, solid and certain. That day became a turning point, not with fireworks or headlines, but in the quiet rebuilding of something that had almost been lost. Raymond started sharing more about the war, about his fears, about the things he regretted. Lincoln, in turn, shared his music more openly. They talked late into the night sometimes, not always about deep things, but always with honesty. The walls between them had cracked, and instead of patching them up, they let the light in. For the first time, Lincoln felt like he wasn't carrying the weight of his own identity alone, and Raymond, for all his discipline and structure, seemed to finally understand that strength didn't mean silence. It meant showing up even when it was uncomfortable. Their bond grew stronger with each passing week, and though the world outside still turned as usual, inside their small home in Wellington, something remarkable was happening. A soldier was healing from a war he didn't even know he was fighting. And a boy who'd once thought he had to hide to survive was finally learning that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is live in the open. What neither of them knew then was that this quiet transformation was only the beginning. Because, while some battles are fought on distant fields, others begin right at home, with truth, with love, and with the decision to never again let fear dictate what a man is allowed to be. Lincoln didn't expect much when he handed his grandfather the worn poem one evening. It had been weeks since the school assembly, and though life had settled into a better rhythm, the memory of that moment still lingered. Raymond took the paper without a word, eyes scanning the lines in the dim light of the kitchen. Lincoln had rewritten it, refined it, not for praise or perfection, but because it mattered to him. What he didn't know was that Raymond had something planned. The next morning, while Lincoln was at school, Raymond drove to the local veterans chapter and submitted the poem to the annual statewide youth writing competition sponsored by the Texas Veterans Alliance. The theme that year, Courage in Modern Times. Raymond didn't mention the submission. He didn't want to build Lincoln up only to see him disappointed. But deep down, he had a feeling that poem was more than a student's work. It was a declaration of quiet bravery, written not to win a medal, but to reclaim dignity. 2 weeks later, an official envelope arrived at the house. Raymond opened it first. When he read the words, "First place winner, youth division," he just stood still for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in. That night, he placed the letter on Lincoln's pillow without a note. When Lincoln saw it, his hands trembled. There was a ceremony in Austin, and they wanted him to perform the poem at the state capitol in front of veterans, politicians, and community leaders. For the first time, he wasn't just being tolerated, he was being asked to speak. They drove to Austin in silence, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Raymond wore his uniform again, pressed and pristine. Lincoln wore a simple white button-down and dark slacks, nothing fancy. But when he stepped onto the stage and saw the crowd, something inside him shifted. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't afraid, he was ready. The poem came out clear and steady. Every line held the weight of that boy who had once been mocked on a school stage and now stood tall in the state capitol, backed by the man who had once feared his softness. The crowd rose when he finished. The applause was real, not polite. Raymond clapped with his hand flat against his chest, jaw tight, eyes glassy. After the ceremony, a retired colonel approached them. He'd served in Vietnam, seen more loss than joy, and rarely spoke in public. But to Lincoln he said, "That poem said more about courage than half the speeches I've heard in my life." Then he looked at Raymond and added, "You raised him right." Raymond didn't correct him. He just nodded and said, "Thank you, sir." On the drive back, they didn't talk much, but everything between them had changed again. Lincoln had been seen not just by his grandfather, but by a room of decorated warriors and leaders, not for hiding who he was, but for standing up and being exactly that. Back in Wellington, the news spread fast. The local paper ran a piece titled, "Wellington Teen Wins Statewide Veterans Award." The school hosted a small assembly where Lincoln read the poem again, this time without a single laugh. The same teacher who had sat quietly during the first disaster introduced him with trembling pride. Lincoln spoke with calm clarity. He wasn't proving anything anymore. He was just living the truth. And somehow, that truth had gained weight. It reached people. It made them pause. He started teaching piano at the community center on Saturdays, and his classes filled up quickly. Even the kids who once mocked him sent younger siblings his way. One afternoon, while organizing sheet music, Lincoln found something in the piano bench, one of Raymond's old journals. It had been left there on purpose. Inside were pages of thoughts from years ago, regrets, memories, drawings, notes. But near the back was a short letter written in Raymond's unmistakable handwriting. It read, "I spent most of my life trying to be the man others told me to be. You taught me to be the man I was supposed to be. I didn't protect your father the way I should have. I won't make that mistake again. You've already done more for this family's name than 100 medals ever could." Lincoln didn't say anything about it, but that night he played a song he'd never played before. It was simple, strong, steady, and Raymond sat there until the last note rang out. The bond between them, once built on unspoken pressure, had turned into something real. Not because they understood each other completely, but because they chose to stand beside each other anyway. Respect no longer came with conditions. It came with presence. When Raymond got a call a week later to speak at a town veterans banquet, he asked if Lincoln would perform with him. Raymond would speak about service and sacrifice, and Lincoln would play afterward. The moment wasn't flashy, but it left a mark. Old men who had never clapped for piano music clapped that night. They saw not just a boy and his talent, but a legacy reclaimed, a family redeemed, and a version of courage they hadn't considered before. The applause was louder than it had been in Austin, not because the audience was bigger, but because it was home. It was the same town that had once laughed and labeled and dismissed. Now it stood, not just for Lincoln, not just for Raymond, but for what it meant to watch two generations of men rebuild something that had nearly been lost in silence. The morning of the Memorial Day service came quietly, but Lincoln could feel the weight of it before he even opened his eyes. The church bells rang early, echoing through Wellington like a steady heartbeat. The town had pulled together for the event in a way it hadn't in years. There were flags lining the streets, folding chairs being set up on the courthouse lawn, and veterans arriving in old uniforms that barely fit but still held every ounce of their dignity. Lincoln had been invited to play piano after the reading of the names, those lost in wars long past, and those remembered by the few who were still here to tell their stories. It wasn't a performance, it was a duty, and for the first time Lincoln understood what that word really meant. Raymond was up before him, dressed in full uniform, every medal perfectly aligned, boots polished like they had been the day he left for Iraq. But there was something different in his stance now, not just pride, but peace. The man who had once buried his softness beneath a wall of silence now walked with purpose, not just as a veteran, but as a grandfather who had made peace with the things he could never change. He didn't say much to Lincoln before they left, just looked him in the eye and said, "I'm proud of you, not because of today, but because you never gave up being who you are." They arrived together, drawing quiet glances as they stepped through the crowd. People still remembered the day Raymond had walked into the school in that same uniform and silenced the cafeteria. That memory hadn't faded. It had spread. Since then, the town had started looking at both of them differently, not as a broken boy and his hard-as-nails grandfather, but as a pair who had stood up for each other when it counted. As they took their places, the ceremony began, prayers, stories, a moment of silence. Then came the roll call of names. It was long, it always was. Names from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. With each name, a bell rang, and with each ring, Lincoln's heart pounded heavier. Then it was his turn. The speaker introduced him briefly, called him a young man who understands sacrifice in a way most adults don't. Lincoln sat at the piano in front of the crowd. No microphone, no lights, just him, the keys, and a town that had finally stopped talking long enough to listen. He started slow, chords that mimicked the sound of footsteps, a melody that rose like morning light. It wasn't flashy. It didn't try to impress. It spoke without words. Somewhere in the middle of the piece, Raymond lowered his head and closed his eyes. Others followed. The music filled the square, steady and proud, just like the men whose names had been called. When Lincoln finished, he stood and gave a small nod. The crowd didn't cheer, they stood, in silence, one by one. Not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, respect, gratitude, understanding. It wasn't just for the fallen, it was for what they had witnessed. Strength passed from one generation to another, not through war, but through healing. Lincoln stepped down, and Raymond was waiting. He reached into his pocket and pulled something small, round and bronze, a service medal. One Raymond had never displayed, never mentioned. He handed it to Lincoln and said, "This one's not for combat, it's for character. I never earned it the way you have." Lincoln didn't speak. He didn't have to. The weight of the medal in his palm told him everything. It wasn't a gift, it was a recognition, a legacy passed forward, not because of a uniform, but because of truth. That afternoon, Raymond and Lincoln sat on the porch, watching the sun dip over the Texas hills. No speeches, no performances, just a grandfather and grandson, side by side, sharing the kind of silence that didn't hurt anymore. And in that stillness, they both knew the war between expectation and identity was finally over. Summer rolled in heavy and slow, the kind that soaked the wooden porch in heat and made time feel like it had no rush. But life in the James household moved with purpose now. Lincoln wasn't the same boy who once curled up in silence, hiding, his heart behind a piano. He stood taller, not louder, not cocky, but sure of who he was and where he stood. After the Memorial Day performance, he received a flood of letters from veterans and families across the state. Some thanked him for the music, others for the words. A few simply said, "You reminded me of someone I lost." That alone made it all worth it. He kept every letter in a box under his bed, the way Raymond once kept journals he never showed. Only now, nothing needed hiding. Raymond watched it all unfold with quiet pride. He still ran his mornings the same way, black coffee, chores and a slow walk around the property, but his face had softened. His posture was still military, but his presence had changed. Neighbors stopped him more often now, not just to talk about weather or fencing, but to ask about Lincoln. "You raised him right," they'd say. And Raymond, without hesitation, always replied, "He raised me back. He meant it too." That boy, that gentle spirit he'd once feared wouldn't survive in a hard world, had taught him that courage didn't always come with weapons or orders. Sometimes it came in the form of patience, sometimes it sat at a piano. Lincoln kept playing every weekend at the community center. Word spread, and the room filled each Saturday. Veterans brought their families. Kids brought notebooks. Some just came to listen. On Saturday, after finishing a new piece inspired by a letter from a soldier's widow, Lincoln stood and thanked the crowd for letting him share stories through music. A little boy in the front row, no older than 8, raised his hand and asked, "Are you going to be a soldier too?" Lincoln paused, then said, "No, but I'll keep fighting in my own way." The answer didn't need explaining. The boy nodded. And Raymond, sitting in the back of the room, smiled quietly. As fall approached, the school asked Lincoln to help lead the Veterans Day Assembly. Not just as a performer, but as a speaker. He agreed, and this time the gym was packed. Not out of obligation, but because people genuinely wanted to hear what he had to say. Teachers sat straighter, students listened, and when Lincoln stood at the microphone, he didn't read a poem. He just spoke about his grandfather, about silence and expectations, about finding your voice, and how sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is admit he doesn't have all the answers. He ended by saying, "Legacy isn't what we leave behind in medals or ribbons. It's how we treat the people who carry our name." The standing ovation wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Raymond didn't say much after the event, but the next morning he handed Lincoln a box. Inside was an old folded flag, one that had draped over the coffin of Raymond's father. "It's yours now," he said simply, "because I want the name James to mean something different moving forward. Not just duty, not just discipline, but heart." Lincoln held the flag carefully. He understood the weight of it, not in fabric, but in history, and this time he wasn't afraid of carrying it. That evening, they sat on the porch again, side by side, no words spoken. The war between generations had ended not with one victory, but with understanding. In a world still quick to label, still slow to listen, one boy and one man had built a bridge where silence once stood, and that was more lasting than any battlefield glory. It was legacy, real and earned. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.